What's up guys, Captain Blade J52 here, and for today's video we're going to be taking a step back from the usual pace of content we do here on the channel and focus a bit on some of the behind the scenes stuff that affects the builds that we feature here on the channel. So this isn't going to be something like our usual proof of concept type of videos that we may feature a Beta Thoradar and Japori type of run in. Instead, for today's video, we're going to be focusing on our skill tree and going over why I've picked the certain points in the skill tree that I have, and understanding why having a basic cohesive skill tree build for what you're wanting to do in game is important. Now, think of your skill tree somewhat as job training in real life, except in this case it's for your character. If you don't have the proper job training for what you're looking to do and the job you're looking to do, you're not going to be able to do that job nearly as effectively as you otherwise could, assuming you can even do the job at all. And as to how that translates into game, if, say, you're somebody that you want to do pure science damage, you could be leaving a lot of science potential on the table that you otherwise could have picked up and used to boost the effectiveness of your builds. If you're looking to be a pure torpedo player, you could be leaving damage potential with your torpedoes on the table that, again, you could have picked up. The same thing goes for somebody that's looking to do pure DPS just from their weapons, or somebody that's looking to tank. You could be leaving, as a tank, threat generation potential on the table, damage negation potential, damage recovery potential. So having a proper skill tree setup is important and is one of the foundations of your character. Now with this, we're going to be looking at the skill tree setup that I've been using on my characters for a while as sort of a universal type of build. I've got it set up somewhat as a jack of all trades without actually being a true jack of all trades in my opinion. It caters more towards the threat generation and survival side of things. And the way I have it set is ideally so that I can pick up pretty much any type of ship in game, whether it be more engineering focused, tactical focused, or science focused, and be able to have a little bit of extra to work with in making it into a full-on tank ship. Now, I dare say that any ship in game today that is T5U, and especially Tier 6, and heck, even some of the T4s, can be made into some kind of a basic tank. It's just a matter of what that particular ship and build is going to need. Now with this, let's go ahead and look at our skill tree. We have our Gamma Vanguard character, our jem'hadar recruit from Victory's Life to help us out with this. And starting with our first row of skills, we're going to go from left to right, and I'm going to touch base on why I picked each point and how it's going to affect our build. Now, to begin, we have 1 point in hull restoration and 1 point in shield restoration each. Now, essentially, reading the tooltip, this is going to increase the total base healing to our hull and our shields by 25%. So this one is going to buff it to the hull, this is going to buff it to the shields. Now, this is essentially a Category 1 type of heal. And for those people that aren't familiar with Category 1 buffs and Category 2 and how to tell the difference, essentially a Category 1 type of buff is going to be a buff to your base numbers. So an example of a Cat 1 type of buff is something like your tactical consoles for your gear that may say plus 30% phaser damage. That's 30% to the base amount of your phasers and not overall. Now if it had said plus 30% bonus phaser damage, that's an example of a Category 2 type of buff because it's buffing everything. It's coming in after all of the other calculations have taken place in that regard. So generally, anytime you see plus bonus, whatever it is, that's going to denote a Category 2 type of buff. In this case, what we're dealing with here with our hull restoration and our shield restoration are category 1 types of buffing. Now, it is worth it to have at least 1 point in each of these, in my opinion, because it is a fairly decent boost in that regard. Now, the reason I don't max out the hull restoration and shield restoration in this regard is because it is just a category 1 type of buff. It's worth having the first point at least, but if the goal is pure healing and survival, then the other two, I guess, the improved and advanced versions, aren't really worthwhile, and there's stronger benefits you can get elsewhere within the skill tree. So that's kind of why we've not maxed those out in that regard. But we'll be taking a look at some of that stuff in just a minute. Now, looking at our other powers, we have improved hull capacity and improved shield capacity. Now, these are pretty much just like they sound. They're going to give us additional maximum hull and maximum shield capacity to work with. So it's 25.5% of each to work with in this regard. Now, these are worth having, in my opinion, at these levels, because that's going to give you additional pools of HP and for your hull and your shields that you can work with. Now, having additional shield and hull HP alone does not mean necessarily you're going to survive. It just gives you more resources to work with that you could use to tank larger hits and so on when combined with other benefits that you might have. So it's worth having in this regard, and the reason I didn't max these out is you're only looking at a 4.5% increase for the advanced versions. If you're somebody that just wants to have that, then okay, you can make arguments for it, but again, it's not necessarily the stats you have that matter as far as your HP as much as it is your ability to maintain it. And this is something I tell people quite often. You could theoretically have, say, 500k shields and 500k hull on a build, but if you don't have an ability to maintain those, then it's not going to help you, and it's basically a countdown to your death at that point. Now, the final skill points that we have invested on our first tier here are points into our energy weapon training. Now, this is going to be just a free damage increase to our energy weapons. Now, I believe this one is a, this is also a category 1 damage boost, so this is essentially like having generalized tactical consoles for your build. No matter what energy type you're using, this is going to buff your damage in that regard. Now, I didn't pick up projectile weapon training in this regard because I don't really use a lot of torpedoes in a lot of my builds. Some builds I do, some builds I don't. But for the builds that I do use them in, they're not the primary source of damage. So I didn't feel it was warranted to pick the skills up in this case. Whereas with energy weapon training, a lot of my damage is going to come from my energy weapons, and of course my threat generation by extension. Now, looking at our second tier of abilities here, we have the improved EPS flow. Now, the reason we didn't pick up the full impulse energy shunt is because you have to be out of combat to initiate full impulse to start with. And depending on the map and how the combat is going, you can't guarantee you're going to drop combat. And even then, in order to drop combat to make use of this ability, that's time that you're losing threat. That's time that you're not producing threat as a tank, which is one of your key jobs, is to pull threat away from your teammates. So that's why we don't really have this, is because it's not going to be used or have the potential to be used enough to be of that much benefit to us. Now, the EPS, or the electroplasma system flow and improved EPS flow, The reasons we have this is going to improve our power transfer rate and some of our power regeneration. As we're throwing our weapons around, as we're firing weapons, this is going to allow that power to come back even faster. And let's say that we have an "oh crap, I'm going to die" type of moment, and you temporarily dump a lot more power into your shields because of that. This is going to let that power move into and out of your shields once the crisis has abated than it otherwise would do. So this is overall a net benefit to you as far as your threat generation potential and potentially your survival as well. Now the next thing we have is our impulse expertise. Now, I like to have at least 1 point into this. There are a couple of my characters out there that have more than 1 point into impulse expertise, and the reason I like to have this is because it's going to give you a bit of extra turn rate. Now this is going to benefit the big beefier ships like the dreadnoughts and cruisers more than it is something like a speedy escort that's not really going to need it as much, but it's still going to benefit them a little bit. And this is basically going to ensure that I'm able to get my ship turned around, put certain weapon facings toward them, certain shield facings, as I need to. So that's why I like to have at least 1 point in impulse expertise. Then we have our improved control expertise and improved drain expertise. Now, some people might be wondering, well, why are you picking those stats up? Aren't those science stats? If you're not going to be running a science ship, why do you really need them? And that's a fair question. Now, the reason I have the improved control expertise is because it goes beyond just science builds in this case. Now, one of the ways you can generate threat as a tank is through the use of zero distance abilities. Now, zero distance abilities are basically powers that generate more threat than normal. And compared to energy weapons, which take distance to the foe into account, such as, let's say I'm shooting at somebody right on that 10-kilometer edge, that's not going to generate usually as much threat as a zero distance power would do. Now, as far as the enemy is concerned, when you're using a zero distance power, even if you fire that off right at the 10-kilometer weapons range edge, as far as the enemy is concerned, you're right on top of them, because the source of damage that's hurting them is right next to them. Hence why it's called a zero distance power. In that regard, is because the source of damage being dealt to the foes is typically at zero distance away. Now, control expertise can help as far as tanking is if you have any type of control-based powers to control the battlefield in this regard. It could be, whereas a good friend of mine might crack off a gravity well to deal damage, I could have a similar gravity well on a different part of the map to try to control the foes. The gravity well isn't going to be my main source of damage, but it's going to allow me to at least control some of the enemies better. Maybe potentially slow an enemy down or yank an enemy off of somebody in this regard. So control expertise can have value to a tank. It's just going to depend on what types of powers you have available to you. And your control expertise, as you can see in the tooltip, it affects disables, holds, repels and pulls, confuse, placates, speed debuffs, and turn rate debuffs. So it has value as a tank in terms of how it can let you control the battlefield better and potentially deal with certain threats. Now, I didn't go for control amplification in this regard because as a tank I typically don't use a lot of control powers. I do have control powers that I use, but they're not the primary tool set that I use in that regard. It's think of it kind of like an electronics store where they may have like 1 or 2 aisles of, electronic type of toys. Toys isn't necessarily what their main focus is, but they do have, a little bit of it there. Now, for me, I just didn't think it was worthwhile to pick up the control amplification in this effect because I didn't think I used it enough. I didn't think I used enough control powers to warrant picking this up. Now, as far as our drain expertise goes, now this can help when, draining foes. You can slow them down, you can debuff them in that regard. If you're using Polaron as a tank, which is a very fun energy type to use, you could potentially debuff some extra power off of foes. You can debuff their power, you could slow them down in that regard. You could, if you're using Tetrion, you could potentially strip even more of their shields away from them. If you've got different power transfer rate debuffs and things of that nature, it's going to let you slow the enemy down just that much more. And that's going to potentially let your group, knock them down that much faster, depending. And also, depending on the power, this could potentially help buff you in some way. Maybe you have something that drains enemy shields, as an example, and buffs you for that same amount. The more shields you drain from your foe, the more shields you get back in return. So that's kind of why we have this, is because it does benefit in some of those areas. The stronger the drain, potentially the more threat you're going to generate in that regard. Now, that's not always the case, but that is the general rule of thumb. Now, for drain infection, the reason we didn't pick this up is kind of similar in that regards. Drain isn't our main focus as a tank in this regard. And for this, the damage isn't really that great. So, while yes, you could argue it is just that extra little bit of damage going out, potentially that extra little bit of threat generation, if the goal is threat generation, there's stronger abilities that can be picked up and utilized elsewhere, or things that could lend to having greater access to some of those stronger abilities, even if that particular ability itself doesn't deal the threat. So, while it can be argued, yes, it is damage going out, yes, it is potentially threat going out, it's not going to be nearly as effective as some other powers are going to be. So that's why I didn't pick it up. Next, we have our improved targeting expertise and our improved defensive maneuvering. Now, our defensive maneuvering, kind of like it sounds, is going to make our ship that much harder to hit. The higher your defense is, then the harder it is going to be in order to tag your ship. And then your targeting expertise kind of goes right along with that in terms of your accuracy. Now, with Season 13 and the way some abilities are right now, is some abilities, when you use them, do suffer a slight accuracy penalty to them just because of the nature of the ability. And the way it sits right now, with certain powers, this is going to help you overcome that accuracy penalty a little bit, and this is also going to make it easier to hit certain targets by helping to bypass some of their defense rating. Now, essentially, whenever you're shooting at a target, essentially the way it breaks down is like it says in the tooltip here for defensive maneuvering. If an attacker's accuracy rating is greater than a target's defense rating, hit chance is 100%. If an attacker's accuracy rating is less than a target's defense rating, hit chance is calculated as 100 divided by 100 plus the defense rating minus accuracy rating, all that in parentheses. So there is a formula for calculating it. Basically, you want your defense rating as a tank to be high as it can be in that regard, because or basically, I guess I should say, the higher you can get your defense rating, the better in that regard, because that's going to mean they have less of a chance to hit you. And as far as dealing threat, you want your accuracy rating to be as high as possible. That way you can guarantee that your attacks are going to hit, ergo you're going to be generating threat. Now, I only put 2 points into each of these because the final point doesn't really give you that much. As far as value, you're looking at a 2.25 overall in terms of additional targeting expertise, and defensive maneuvering. And while that is additional accuracy and additional defense, there are benefits you can pick up elsewhere that are more than going to make up for this. There's traits you can pick up, certain abilities you can pick up that are going to close that gap and give you even extra on top of that. And this is going to free up points in your skill tree that can give you benefits to other areas. So think of it as a case of, why have just these two smaller benefits over here when I can have these even greater benefits over there, if that makes sense. Getting into our fourth tier of abilities, this is where things start to get even more interesting in my opinion. Now, we have over here our Hulp Lightings. We have the first one, which is Hulp Lighting. This is going to give total energy damage resistance and kinetic and physical damage resistance on top of that, so that's going to buff damage resistance to everything. Then we have two additional points, one for Energized Hulp Lighting, which is going to give additional energy damage resistance, and then one for Ablative Hulp Lighting, which is going to give additional kinetic and physical damage resistance. Now, the reason we picked up all three of these is because this is free damage negation here. This is free damage negation that you're not having to invest traits into, not having to invest buff powers into, and pieces of gear. This is something that you're always going to have. It's always going to be active all the time, and it's something you're going to benefit pretty well from. So by picking it up here in the skill tree, this frees up certain buff powers, certain traits that you might have used for damage negation that you could use for something else. You might pick up additional heals, additional threat generating abilities. It just depends on what your individual need is going to be as a tank. And even if you do decide to pick up additional damage negation, then you already have this chunk of damage negation to build on top of. And it's going to go along with the additional stuff you're going to pick up. So either way, you win in this case. Now, we're going to look at our damage control and our shield regeneration abilities last. We're going to explain, as far as this particular tier anyway, why we didn't pick those. Now, getting into our next skills, we have the improved shield hardness, and essentially what this is going to do is it's an additional shield damage negation. Now, it explains it a little bit here. It increases the amount of incoming damage negated by your shields. By default, each point of shield subsystem power negates 0.2% of the damage your shields take. Every point of shield hardness skill will negate an additional 0.2% regardless of your current shield subsystem power. So this essentially means that what your shields say on them, such as a 10% damage reduction, that sort of stuff, that's the kind of thing it's talking about here. So for each additional point into your shields, this is additional damage you're going to be able to shake off for free. Now, it's worth having the first 2 points because it's a substantial increase, and I don't pick up the third point here because it's not that substantial of an increase, and even then there's other consoles and abilities that will let you make up that 3% fairly easily. And again, it comes down to a case of, why have just this smaller benefit here when you can have even greater benefits over there? And a prime example of a console that does this is something like your oh crap, I'm having a brain fart. Like your the butterfly console, your temporal disentanglement suite. I don't know why I couldn't think of that this morning. But anyway, something like your temporal disentanglement suite here. It has 3% shield resistance on it, so there's the extra 3% made up right there. So that's why we didn't pick up the third point in shield hardness. Now, as far as our tactical abilities here, weapon amplification and specialization, weapon amplification is going to give us an additional 40% crit severity for free. So this means that whenever we do critically hit as a tank, our attacks are going to hit just that much harder and generate just that much additional threat. So this is, in my opinion, kind of a no-brainer. This is going to give you additional knockdown power that you can use and potential threat generation. Next we have our specialization. This is going to give us additional critical hit chance. This is going to increase the chance that we have to deal a critical hit. Now in regards to crit chance and severity, you kind of want to have somewhat of a balance of the two of them. Because if you have a lot of crit chance but no severity, then you may be hitting criticals quite often, but they're going to do next to nothing extra in terms of damage, so the extra crit chance is wasted. On the opposite end of that coin, if you have a lot of severity but no critical chance, then again, that's wasted because you're not going to crit that often. And you're not going to be able to deal that extra threat generation, that extra knockdown potential. So you kind of want to have a balance in regards to that. Typically, I recommend at least 20% critical chance for tanks, and if you can get over 120% severity, then you're doing pretty good. You know, obviously, the more you can get of both, the better, you know, but that's at least the minimums that I typically recommend to people in that regard. Now, the reason we didn't pick up damage control or shield regeneration is because they offer next to nothing in terms of benefits. Now, the way this states for damage control is just one example. This skill increases the rate at which your hull is passively repaired over time. Each point of damage control skill increases your regeneration rate by 1% of its base regeneration value. All starships, as it says here, have unique base regeneration values which may vary from ship to ship. The skill will always provide a percentage-based improvement to that base value. Base regeneration is reduced to 20% of its full value while in combat. Okay, so the reason that we don't pick this up, and it's the same general principle for your shield regeneration. What this is talking about is things like you might see on a shield that says X amount of shield regeneration every 6 seconds. This is the type of benefit that this is talking about. And what this is going to essentially do is it's going to buff up to 1% of that. So if, say, you're regenerating, let's say you could regenerate up to 100 points of hull, you know, every second, and this is just to keep the number simple in my head. Let's say you could regenerate 100 points of hull every second while in combat, or while out of combat. Whenever you go into combat, that's going to be cut down to 20 points of hull per second, and that is what this is buffing. So this benefit is going to essentially be cut down drastically to the point it's next to nothing. At that point, even with all 3 points into the ability, you're looking at maybe a 1% increase of a base value. And even then, let's say you heal that 100 points of hull. Okay, well, all it takes is one shot to remove that extra hull that's been regenerated, or that extra bit of shields that's been regenerated, and then you're back to square one. You've basically wasted the last 6 seconds in that regard for a minuscule heal, and it's just not worth it. And this comes down to a case of, again, why have these minor benefits when you can get better increases and better heals elsewhere in this regard? So that's why I always tell people avoid the damage control skill points and avoid the shield regeneration points. The only time that these are worth picking up is if you're trying to go for a quote-unquote ultimate build that involves having so many points invested in order to get something like the focused frenzy, the probability manipulation, or the EPS corruption. Unless you're going for one of these 3 powers down here, it is not worth it to pick up the shield regeneration and the damage control powers, because the healing effects you're going to get from them are minuscule compared to traits and other abilities you can pick up elsewhere. Now, on our next tier of abilities, we have the defensive subsystem tuning and the offensive subsystem tuning. Now, these are worth having the first points in my opinion, because this is going to be free power going out to each of your subsystems. So this one is going to give some to your shields and Onks. This is going to give some to your weapons and engines. So you're going to get a little bit of extra in this regard. Now, there are additional points that you could specialize even further and pick up additional power. Like this one's for shields, this one's for Ox, this one's for weapons, this one's for engines. Now, the reason I never pick these up is because, one, you only get power for that one individual subsystem. And even then, it's not the greatest amount of power. It would give you a total of +8 to that power if you have this first point plus one of these. And the reason I don't pick these up is because you can get greater amounts of power elsewhere in the skill tree, and we're going to be looking at that in just a moment. And it's a case of, why have this level of benefit here when you can have an even greater level of the same benefit over here, and you can get additional power out of it. Next, we have our improved exotic particle generator. Now, this is one of those powers where I kind of have it to let me adapt to any build in front of me. If I did want to take a more science-heavy ship out there and try to tank with it, this is going to give me a little bit of EPG to work with in order to cheese a bit more of the zero distance powers type of thing. So that's what we have for our EPG in this regard, and I only put not 3 points, but I only put 2 points into this so I could use some other points elsewhere. Now, on some characters where I know I'm not going to be using a lot of science powers, or I'm probably not going to be touching a science ship, then I might take these 2 points out and put them into something like Impulse Expertise for extra turn rate if I know I'm going to be using bigger, beefier ships. It just, again, it really depends on the character and what I'm looking to do. But as a general rule of thumb, I do like to have, for the somewhat of a one-size-fits-all build, these 2 points here. Now, this is one of the things that I would consider mandatory if you're going to be using weapons on your build. And that is going to be 99% of all builds within the game. There are a few certain builds out there, especially the science builds, that don't need weapons in order to do their damage. Now, those are highly, highly specialized builds, and 99% of all builds within the game are going to require at least some kind of weapon to do some of their damage. Now, essentially what this is, the long-range target sensors, is there is a weapon drop-off penalty within the game. Now, the farther away you are from the target, and it explains the breakdown here. By default, being far away from your foe can cause all energy weapons to lose up to 50% of their potential base damage. Penalty starts at 0% at 2 kilometers or closer, and scales up to 50% loss when at exactly 10 kilometers from the target. Each range of long-range target sensors reduces the maximum penalty by 10%. So essentially, think of it kind of like firing a gun in real life. You know, the farther away the bullet has to go, the more of its, potential kinetic energy and stuff it's going to lose. The farther out it goes, over time the bullet is going to start to slow down, and it's going to have less and less chance of actually being lethal. And at certain distances out, it's not going to do anything at all. So that's kind of a similar principle to what's going on here. The farther you are away from your target with your weapons, you are going to suffer a slight drop-off penalty. Now, having all 3 of these points reduces that penalty to only a minus 20%. So you are still going to potentially lose a little bit, but you're not going to lose nearly as much as you otherwise could have. Now, this is going to be free damage potential by having this. That's more damage going towards your foes if you're a damage dealer. This is more threat generation potential because more of your damage is getting through to your foes in this regard. Then the next points we have are the ones in hull penetration. Now, this is typically where I'll tell people, you have your choice of hull penetration or shield penetration in this regard. There is no right or wrong answer in this case. Now, there's arguments that can be made for each one and arguments that can be made against each one. Now, your hull penetration, this is essentially going to allow you to bypass a little bit of the enemy's armor as though it's not there, essentially meaning they're going to take a bit of additional damage against you. And this is potentially threat generation that you're going to pick up. The same thing is true with your shields. This is additional bleed through that the enemy shields are going to suffer in this regard. Now, some of the arguments that can be made in favor of hull penetration and against the shield penetration is that if once the shields go down, then the shield penetration skill is useless. And it's all about the hull at that point. Once you've drained the shields, there's no shields to penetrate in that regard. So the shield penetration isn't really going to help you that much. Whereas at that point, you want to get through as much of that hull as you can, as quickly as you can in that regard. Then, that's some of the points that can be made for hull penetration. Now, for some of the points that can be made as far as shield penetration, one of the arguments in favor of shield pen is that if you can't get through the shields to start with, then the hull penetration isn't going to matter. And this allows you to bleed additional damage through the shields that is going to be going to their hull. And if you can't get through the shields to start with, then no amount of hull penetration is going to matter in this regard. So there's arguments that can be made for and against each one. There is no right or wrong answer here. There are more abilities that seem to cater towards hull penetration in the game as of late, so that's what I've been going with in that regard. Is I typically leave, busting the shields down for the most part to the damage dealers that are in the run with me, and I've gotten better mileage out of the hull pen lately. But as far as this goes, there is no right or wrong answer. I have seen some builds that use both of these even. So it just kind of depends on what you're looking for. But as far as for me, I've been going for hull pen as of late. Now, on our final tier of the actual skill points, we have the warp core potential. Now, this is getting into what I was talking about above when dealing with offensive and defensive subsystem tuning. This kind of skill is the reason why I never pick up any of these here unless I'm doing something that is highly specialized. Reason being is warp core potential is power to all of your subsystems. That's not just a +3 power. That's a +3 power to each of your 4 subsystems. So off of this one skill point, you're getting 12 total additional power for your ship. And if you did want to specialize even further, instead of picking one of these 4 here, consider perhaps picking up warp core potential. Or improved warp core potential, I should say. Because that's an additional 2 power going out to all of your subsystems. So you're looking at a total of 5 power between this point and this point that's going to each of your subsystems. So you're looking at a total of 20 points of power that's going to your ship between this point and this point here. So it is worth picking up these first 2 points up here, but I don't pick up these because instead of getting just 3.2 power to one individual system, why not just pick up this point here and get more total power for your entire ship versus just something that is super highly specialized. Like in this instance, it would take, because this on its own is worth essentially 8 power to you in this regard, it would take at least 2 of these to come close to breaking even. It would actually take 3 of these points to finally surpass the amount of power you could get off of just this one. So why spend, in my mind, it's why spend the 3 extra skill points you don't have to when you could pick up this and get a similar, if not better, effect. The only time I typically recommend these is if you're going for something super specialized, or again, if you're looking to pick up something like the EPS corruption ability. That's the only time I recommend those. Then we have the, again, improved warp core potential for the extra power if you did want it. We do have warp core efficiency in this regard, which is going to buff our power levels if they're really low in that regard. So this essentially ensures that our power levels aren't going to get super low in this regard. So it could be worth considering, but I didn't pick up these 2 points because I wanted to save them for abilities that I thought would be better used elsewhere in the skill tree. So we have our warp core potential in this regard. That's going to be free power to our ship. Now, we have 2 points in improved engineering readiness and improved tactical readiness. Now, essentially what these are going to do is reduce the cooldown time of our engineering and tactical abilities by 17% in this regard. So, whatever our ability is baseline, say it's a 30-second cooldown, knock 17% off of that, and that's essentially what you're going to be picking up here in this regard. So this is going to allow us to use our engineering powers just that much more often, and it will stack with other bits of engineering readiness you're able to pick up. So if you're able to pick up additional cooldown reducing abilities, it's going to stack on top of this and cool down just that much faster, to the point that eventually, in some cases, you can get abilities to outright global. So that's what you're going to have for your engineering readiness. It's the same principle with tactical abilities. Now, a lot of our abilities as a tank, some of them are very engineering focused. There's a lot of healing engineering powers. There's a lot of threat generating type of engineering powers. So that's why we picked 2 points in this. Then with our tactical powers, things like our attack pattern delta, being able to use that for a threat bomb. That's one reason why we have that, is for this sort of thing. So that's going to let us potentially threat bomb a lot faster, a lot more often. That's going to allow us to generate more threat because we're able to fire our weapons at more foes more often. And overall, it's a greater increase in threat potential and potential knockdown power because you're able to use weapon enhancements and stuff a lot more often. Now, one option you do have is potentially moving these exotic particle into the scientific readiness. If you think you're going to be using a lot of those type of powers. Now, some builds have all 3 readiness type abilities. Again, it depends on what you need. But that's what I have as far as my actual skill point investments, what I've invested in each area and why. Now, down here at the bottom, you have, as you invest skill points, you're going to unlock a choice in each of these areas. You'll see little green dots flashing. And for those, most of them are typically personal preference. Like this thing here, sector speed or transwarp cooldown. Then, come back to that one in a second, like projectile critical chance or critical damage. Then energy critical chance or damage, hanger, pet health, or battery duration. It just depends on what your personal preferences are and what you're looking to do in that regard. Now, as far as tanking goes, down here, the only one that I really consider mandatory is threat control. And reason being is because this is going to give you an additional 100% threat generation for free while you're in threatening stance. And if for some reason you need to drop threat and you need to take yourself out of threatening stance, this is going to be an additional 100% threat reduction to assist in that regard. So this is the only one that I really consider mandatory as far as if you want to tank down here, because that's free threat generation that you could be picking up that there's really no reason to leave on the table. So that's what we have as far as our skill tree goes. I know this video is kind of a bit longer, and this is why I've not featured, full-on skill tree explanations in some of my other videos for quite some time. Is because I figured it would be easier to make a video like this, where people can get a detailed breakdown of why we picked each point that we picked, as well as understanding some of the formulas and calculations behind it. But I hope this has been beneficial to you guys. I'll have this up on the channel that folks can refer back to. If for some reason the skill tree changes in the future, then I guess I'll remake this. But for folks that want a detailed breakdown of the skill tree, I hope this has been helpful for you guys, if I could words today, and you understand a bit more behind the scenes of why I invested each point where I did, and what some of the consequences and benefits of that are. But for now, folks, if you're looking for more tailored skill tree advice, I can definitely help with that, like I touched base on at the start. If you're looking for something a bit more specialized than this, feel free to leave questions, comments. I'll try to help you adapt to what you're looking to do, and we can go from there. But for now, folks, this is Captain Blade J52 signing off.